I'm just amazed by this conference. The lineup of speakers is, I mean, just even a few years ago, you'd never get this many, this much great thinking and experience in mobile in one room. So, as the final speaker, a huge round of applause to PBK and all the organizers for bringing together such great. So, as the final speaker, I know that I am the wall between now and beers and the rest of your weekend. So. I'm going to talk about this concept of resonance and creating a mobile design ethos, and really trying to help you give the tools of on Monday we all go back to our lives, and we want to take all the things that we've learned, and what do we do with it next? And you know, it's a really interesting and exciting time, and I completely agree with Liza and a lot of the other speakers. There's so much exciting things happening right now. In fact, you can map this where we have the evolution of computing and the network and the internet and the devices and the web. And when you draw a line between 2012, you start to see that never before in the history of technology have we had so many different types of technology all aligned and entering into their next phase and next evolution. However, I like to share this diagram. I pulled it out and I put it back in, and one of the recurring themes I'm kind of hearing is that I think that we too often conflate what is the internet with what is the World Wide Web. They are two different things, and mobile exists on top of the internet, and the World Wide Web is part of mobile. And so anyway, this is going to kind of come back and forth into my talk. But what I really want to focus on is how do you take everything you've learned and build something that resonates. And I like to look at Instagram and the recent acquisition. It's a $1 billion acquisition as kind of a big event. A lot of people are talking about it. Is there a bubble happening in mobile and in apps? And you know, and I think that there's something to be said. I mean, Instagram, I'm actually not an Instagram user because it's a weird thing. I like to get Fling, and Fling was already taken by the time I discovered Instagram, so I could only get Fling, and so I never used it. But there are a lot of people that love this application. And I think when we look at the App Store reviews, obviously this is a little bit harder to do with web apps. When we're looking at App Store reviews, this is a really important and powerful metric to see if an application is resonating with customers. It's one of the things we always talk about, because usually people, even if they're thinking about doing a web app or hybrid approach, they're still looking, have eyes in some sort of app store. They want to get it out into many different marketplaces, in addition to just having it freely available on the web. And so the App Store rating, or App Store ratings, is a really good metric for success. So how do you create a 5-star app? This is one of the things that we actually talk about quite a bit, is we shoot for 4 stars or higher in any project that we do. And that takes a lot of work. And so when looking at the App Store, so this is the top paid application, iPad applications for the US store. I did a little bit of research, and so the top 10 applications all have 4.4 stars or higher, that was the average. The top 25 have 4.34 stars, and the top 50 have 4.29 stars. So you can see just a real quick analysis, you can kind of see that the ratings do kind of equate to sales. The same thing is true in the free applications and a lot of other marketplaces, that obviously the more people like things, the more it's downloaded, the higher it moves up in what was once called the deck in old school mobile terms. And so that brings me, that's actually a nice segue into kind of my personal journey in mobile. So it started, like, it was funny, Remy talked about this earlier, with the Nokia 7710, which was the first mobile web phone. And this came to the US, obviously. I'm from the US in Seattle, which is kind of the birthplace of wireless in the US. And I worked for this company called 3DEF, and 3DEF, you know. Anyway, and so we created these applications, which was email application, calendar application, contacts, and it all worked in a web browser. But more importantly, we made it all work on that phone too. And this was really my first experience in mobile, but it was also my first experience in web. And so I designed that application back in the day. We wanted to kind of make it look like a website. I'm sorry, an application and whatnot. And so anyway, so I think it was really fascinating because we have like this, responsive design 99. But then the .com crash happened, and being in Seattle, that unfortunately didn't work out. Later on, I worked for another company called Dwango, which stood for Doom Wide Area Network Gaming Operations. And they started by just getting people to network Doom and then Heretic and all these other games. But then they expanded out into Japan, which was the mobile devices because of Docomo's rapid acceleration, iMode and whatnot. They expanded over into Japan, and they became a very big mobile content producer. So then back in North America, we created mobile applications for Rolling Stone, Napster, and a few others. And so pretty much when you had to create these, we were mostly selling ringtones, images, and maybe some games. This always included creating a desktop website, a native application written in Brew and J2ME, as well as a WAP site, an old school website like Remy showed, as well as an XHTML MP, mobile profile site as well. And so many of these sites, I was convinced that there was a better way to do this, and we didn't need to be able to create 3 different versions of the site. So I actually used movable type, which is a popular blog system back in the day, to actually power all these sites and be able to output multiple forms of that, and try to use style sheets whenever possible to have it gracefully degrade, but also to output multiple forms of that content, one that's highly optimized for speed and rendering, and others just for desktop devices, which, there's a lot of controversy within W3C, but back in the day we used to call it the one web debate. But again, it's like, this is still like, we're focused with responsiveness. We used to call it, responsiveness meant speed, but it also meant that trying to use a single form of content to render on multiple devices. And then in 2007, of course, the iPhone came along and everything changed. So I had an agency called Blue Flavor, and we created this thing called Leaflets, and we wanted to show what could be done with web standards on a mobile device, having this really powerful browser. So we created these applications, just web apps, in a matter of 2 weeks. And they were highly successful, so successful that I was able to break off from my agency, really do mobile web apps full time, and between the 2008 and 2009, I wrote a book for O'Reilly, as well as basically made a bunch of mobile web apps, consulted with companies like Best Buy and whatnot. But then an interesting thing happened. The SDK was released, and the market for mobile web apps completely dried up. And it was I had my book, and also the market crisis happened. So I kind of rebranded and created the firm that I own now, which is called Pinch Zoom. And so we've been really fortunate to work with some very large customers and deal with a lot of big problems over the last 3 years. So BBC, Adobe, ADP, this is our own product, but also worked with HSBC, New York Times, et cetera, to help them craft their mobile solutions. So I was actually at a meeting in Roseland, New Jersey, talking to our client ADP, which is the largest payroll processor in the US, and they said, "What makes a 5-star app? Who knows that? Who knows how to do that?" He kind of asked this question to everyone in the room. I was like, "Well, I know exactly how you make a 5-star app. It's not, most clients won't allow you to create a 5-star app because they don't have the kind of the fortitude to do what it takes to actually do that. But it's really simple. It's 3 aspects. One is really understanding your users and how people think, so the anthropology exercise. The other one is really firmly understanding the technology, and the third one is having really great design. It's not that much more complicated. Steve Jobs talked about this, that Apple was focused on the intersection of technology and the liberal arts, which was kind of lifted from Edward Land, one of his heroes. And so to become an expert at all 3 of these things is a term called polymath, or Renaissance man, which Leonardo da Vinci is kind of the signature Renaissance man or polymath. Steve Jobs is also considered to be a polymath. But polymaths are quite rare. Most organizations don't have polymaths. So what I want to do is I want to actually use this as a structure to kind of tell you, here's these 3 different aspects, and let's dive into them a little bit in the time we have together to just kind of explain some of the tools that I use to be able to create these 5-star applications and create these experiences that really resonate. And since the majority of you are technologists, I'm going to start with the technology. I'm going to come to the design last. So I've heard the speakers and a lot of the talks today is everyone says, I don't want to talk about the native versus mobile web debate. I don't want to engage in that discussion. And I understand why. It is a bit of a landmine. I've stepped on it many times. I like to step on it. I think it's kind of interesting because this is a debate that we should be having, and now is a good time to be talking about this. I want to kind of dispel the myth that mobile has never been a zero-sum game, and it probably never will be. That it isn't picking one or the other. It's understanding that mobile is a very, very big industry. It's a $1 trillion and growing industry, which, to put that into comparison, that is bigger than the entire beverage industry combined. All soda, bottled water, energy drinks, as well as all alcohol and beer. Right? So it's massive. And as we have already heard, it's 6 billion connections and growing. It's the most ubiquitous mass media that we've ever had in the history of humanity. So it's big, and there's a lot of room for a lot of different technologies. So the way I kind of break this down is the 10 different types of mobile apps, or mobile experiences. I'm going to call them mobile apps because that fit onto my slide a little bit better. The first one is, or app number 10. So this is kind of the lowest type of experience is a mobile website. So that is creating a site that is basically oriented towards lower-end phones. And when we say lower-end, we're really saying BlackBerry 5 or lower. So feature phones and that sort of thing. And as PPK mentioned, this is still one of the most predominant accesses to the internet and to the mobile web is through these types of sites. And they're not to be forgotten. And so when you work with really large customers, you unfortunately have to support this. And so if anybody has an old BlackBerry 5, I'm willing to buy it from them after this. And unfortunately, one of the most reliable ways to create mobile websites is actually using tables to control your layout. It was back in the day. It still is today. That the CSS support, especially in some markets, isn't necessarily great. And so when you have a customer like HSBC that's in 93 markets around the world, that's a consideration. And that's something that you have to think about. And I think about that, not everybody has to work with a company as big as HSBC, but the more I think about it, the more I think about how small our world is becoming. Well, then that also means they should be included in all this information as well. And so it's something that we definitely need to keep considering, but we'll keep moving on because we have a lot more to talk about. There's several people here from Mobilify, which is just north of Seattle and Vancouver, and they actually have a really great tool that allows you to take your website content and turn that into a mobile website. So there's some interesting solutions, even that are still being provided just to provide these basic solutions. The next one is a desktop website. And of course, this is the do-nothing approach where you can pretty much have a desktop website, you don't do anything, and for most smartphones, modern phones, Opera Mobile, Opera Mini will all render a desktop website onto a mobile device pretty well. So we aren't even going to talk about that one. The one we like to really talk about is a responsive website, and we like to use the Boston Globe as that example. And when we're talking about responsive websites, we're usually talking about page-driven, which typically also mean ad-driven models. So that's a lot of different pages, kind of like what James talked about. And we're really just trying to add compatibility. Now, then we have the next one is the desktop web app. And I think Twitter is a really great example of that. And this is when we're starting to get into more Ajax-y-like experiences. And most of these just work on modern smartphones. But this is still kind of a do-nothing approach, though there can be some technical challenges to that. The next one is an HTML5 mobile application. And so this is an Ajax-based web app designed specifically to work with a mobile device. Now, these mostly just work on the modern smartphones, but they can be designed to be somewhat backwards compatible. And again, as we've talked about with a lot of the device APIs, that we can do a lot with these, and we can have some pretty awesome experiences, but they still can't do everything a native app can do. In fact, I wrote a blog post last year about the anatomy of an HTML5 mobile app, where I was basically talking about, well, it's totally doable to create a native-like experience using HTML5 technologies. It just, we underestimate all the different things that are involved with creating that. And even to this day, I put at the center the UX patterns, the mobile patterns to define what creates that, all these different experiences. These are defined in all the different native SDKs, Apple's infamous human interface guidelines being one of them, but no one has ever defined interface patterns for the mobile web and those UX patterns, which are at the heart of just determining something simple as a common language we can use to express all these different interactions, which we usually use as HTML classes. So there's still a lot of work to be done with defining this as a long-term platform. But there's some people that are working on this. Obviously, we have jQuery Mobile, which includes both the JavaScript library. They have the style sheet with all the different interface elements. Sencha Touch does the same thing. And these become really useful frameworks to kind of solving that problem, because they fill in a lot of those kind of required elements to creating these type of applications. The next one is a responsive web app. And there aren't very many examples of this, but Twitter's Bootstrap is actually a really good starting point for creating these type of applications. And these are basically using media queries to create different HTML or AJAX-based web app experiences, which are a little bit different than your typical websites, obviously. So we're using JavaScript to kind of load in content, to do animations like paging, to deal with back history, things like that. We're all doing through these, but we're also making that work on tablets and desktops and other devices. Now, one of the challenges I think that we have is once we start looking at building these type of applications, we have a tendency to kind of forget some of the rules of design that have existed for 100 years or more, this one being the geometry of a book and how someone actually navigates through pages and whatnot. And so this is something that we've actually spent a lot of time with, like the New York Times and BBC, is understanding which direction, which orientation users prefer to navigate content in. And on phones, they like to scroll, and on tablets, they like to swipe. And we have a ton of data to be able to support that this is a universal truth. But that's actually a really hard thing to do, to be able to have one source of content and use JavaScript to say, well, it's going to scroll sometimes with maybe a fixed header, fixed footer, but then on a tablet, we're going to use the same code and it's going to swipe. The viewport was never designed to break horizontally and be a 30, 40, 100-page stack that exists that the user can just swipe through. It's really challenging. Not to mention that we also have some of these patterns I was talking about. So every device obviously has two orientations. So when you create these layouts and these wireframes, here's one for iPad landscape, here's one for iPad portrait. Same content, but then presented differently. But then what happens when we shrink that down to the mobile devices? How do we take those same layouts and still keep them, the presentation and the content still very meaningful, much to what Lisa was talking about? So this is a big challenge. And so I use, as any sushi lover will say, I created a framework that uses sushi names as a way to be able to define a specific layout, and then you just put that in the body class, and then it inherits it for all the different devices. The next one is an HTML5 hybrid application. And this is using web technologies to render all the different content, and you're largely using native technologies to create a wrapper around that to distribute that into the app stores. Now, we did something similar for this. This is Adobe's Creative Cloud product. There's a couple announcements about this week that we worked with them last year. But there's also tools like AppCelerator and PhoneGap that largely do this. They're these containers that support many different platforms. Now, Brian, where's Brian? I like to, there he is, yeah. So he actually mentioned earlier today, he's like, why should you learn 8 languages when you could just learn 1? And so I like to give him a little bit of grief. So in their gallery, for example, they have feature 15 different applications on the PhoneGap website. And so I like to pull this up every once in a while because a lot of people ask about PhoneGap and other types of hybrid technologies, and they want to see really good references of that. And I think they're really great projects, but I also need examples to be able to kind of sell that technique. So of the 15 that were featured, I just did real quick after he said that. I wasn't going to do this, but after he made that remark earlier today on the panel, so of that 15, only 40% of them actually support any platform other than iOS. And of those 15, they only average 3.28 stars, which is actually about right for like free applications. It's not great, but it's not bad either. But I do think that just because we can do it doesn't necessarily mean that people are. So it's still very difficult to even deploy applications. I'm not sure why they do it, but I think it's also it's kind of fascinating to kind of explore some of what we see the press releases about, or what people start talking about a particular technology. Really start to dive into these details and understand that before we make a firm recommendation. The number one reason being that any application that gets sent through the App Store has to pass the HIG, obviously. A lot of people bemoan these type of draconian type of policies, but really what they're trying to do is maintain the integrity of their platform. So if you do want to deploy this application, you do have to have a detailed disclosure icon, and you have to have a disclosure icon. You have to use those consistently. And when you're using web technologies, that's okay. You just have to create this. And there's very few frameworks that actually are out there that provide these tools for you. And unfortunately, they're kind of mixed in with the JavaScript frameworks. So there isn't, to my knowledge, there's no CSS-only framework that provides all this. There's like a couple mobile bootstrap forks and a few other things that are trying to do that. But these are the requirements of the HIG. You have to have all of these elements defined. And so when we start a mobile web app project, we start with a kitchen sink of just all these interface elements that we know are required for the HIG. The Tihan Lax up in Canada, in Toronto, I mean, they've provided a great PSD, and this is a good visual example of all the interface elements that need to be created, and this is just for one platform. But all of these things are part of the HIG. It's over 90 different elements that you just need to account for when you start going down a web approach. And that leads me to the next type of application, which is a native hybrid application, where you're trying to actually use the best of both worlds. Where you use native platform SDKs to create a lot of the windowing and some of the special effects like we see in the Facebook application with the menu that's become very popular. But the rest of the content is actually all web content. And LinkedIn took a similar approach. This is a very great approach to use, and you can still use tools like PhoneGap and Appcelerator to be able to create these type of applications too. We found it really useful for publishers, that we create a native container. We call this pinch zoom press. And we created a native container, but everything else is horizontally oriented web content, all done in HTML5. And then the next one is a native application, which again, we don't need to talk too much about. We all know the juggernaut of the iTunes App Store. But this is basically something that's just built with SDKs. The last one I want to talk about, and I won't talk about too much because Liza did an excellent job talking about this concept of universal publishing. And this is creating a mobile, tablet, and desktop application that provides an optimal experience, and maybe a combination. You may say, well, we're going to do a native application over here, and we're going to do an HTML5 application here, and we're going to do a mobile website as a third option. And we start to kind of get into this weird, like, the experience doesn't exist until the user actually uses it type of scenario. And we're starting to actually talk about, again, Liza already talked about the NPR and their COPE system, and it's very fascinating. This is a problem that a lot of big sites that we encounter are dealing with every day. And she already showed this diagram. In fact, we built this technology that we call Proxy to solve the same problem. We did it initially for ADP and then for ourselves by some of the creators of Expression Engine. So to wrap up the 10, we have these 10 different sites. Now, once we start getting into the anthropology, we have, there's one guy I used to work with said, everybody has a different color house for a reason. And there's a great designer, Dieter Rams, that was able to really start to bring some of the concepts of the Bauhaus and some of the other design movements of the early 20th century and be able to create these really amazingly beautiful products. And so he created a design ethos that was based around this concept of less but better. This was an extension of the Bauhaus concept, less is more, by Mies van der Rohe. And he does a great interview on Objectified.
diese Beliebigkeit und die auch damit verbundene Gedankenlosigkeit, mit der vieles produziert und vermarktet wird. Nicht nur auf dem Gebrauchsgütersektor, sondern in der Architektur, in der Werbung. Überall haben wir zu viel Überflüssiges. Gutes Design sollte innovatives sein. Gutes Design macht ein Produkt brauchbar. Gutes Design ist ästhetisches Design. Gutes Design macht ein Produkt verständlich. Gutes Design ist ehrlich. Gutes Design ist unaufdringlich. Gutes Design ist langlebig. Gutes Design ist konsequent bis ins letzte Detail. Gutes Design ist umweltfreundlich. Last but not least, gutes Design ist so wenig Design wie möglich. Wir Designer arbeiten nicht im luftleeren Raum. Wir brauchen die Unternehmerseite. Wir sind keine freien Künstler, wie das oft verwechselt wird. Haben Sie wieder nur wenige Firmen, die Design, wie ich es verstehe, wirklich ernst nehmen. Und das ist im Moment wieder eine amerikanische Firma. Das ist Apple.
Now, if you haven't seen Objectified, I highly urge you to see it. The next interview is with Johnny Ive and talking about understanding the manufacturing process in order to create these really great products. And there's so much to be kind of derived from this. But if we take Dieter Rams' 10 design principles for good design, and I kind of translate them into a little bit more technical terms, we have some pretty solid principles that are still used at Apple today to be able to create these amazing products that actually have the power to sometimes change our lives. Now, I have unabashedly stolen these principles, and I use them in workshops to be able to help customers understand and talk about their products. And so I just start with taking the 10 principles, putting them up on Post-it notes on whatever wall space I can find, in this case, a glass wall. And then I put the audiences over on the left side that they want to be able to cater to, and then we start going through and saying, well, how could we make this product innovative for the CEO or for a manager? And so we start having this really interesting model that I've used over and over again and has been really helpful and useful. So to just use an example, Flipboard, which is a 5-star app in the App Store, we can use this model. It's a little tight, I'm sorry, because of the I had to fit all 10 across. But if we have the users and the publishers, which is their secondary audience, we can start to put in that one way that Flipboard is innovative is to have this social magazine. And one way that it's honest is that it's my content and not someone else's content. It's the content that I've selected, brought to me. It's useful. It's easy to catch up. There's no filler. There's no content that I don't actually want to see. It's beautiful because it uses amazing photos and typography. It's easy to use because it's easy to read, and swipeable, et cetera. It's unobtrusive, obvious, not complicated, and so on. And so we can start to use this as this interesting framework, and then we can move down to the next user. And then from this, we can start to create, and you see this is a very kind of platform-agnostic way to be able to describe what this product is going to be. From this, we can start to create what's called a design language, which is a little bit broader than a style guide. And this is to be able to create a unifying design language that is going to exist on all these different platforms, both known and unknown. They're the fundamental truths to this brand, to this product, that is going to make it innovative and useful and honest and all the different concepts that Dieter Rams talks about. So the goal of the design language is to create an ethos that helps anticipate user needs, basically user patterns, while maintaining aesthetic consistency. Now, I've never really been a huge fan of anything that Microsoft's done, even though they come from my hometown, but I do have to applaud them on Metro. It is an amazing design language that started with Windows Phone. And if you've seen what Windows 6.5 looked like and how they went from 6.5 to 7, it's just a monumental leap forward for UX and UI design. And the reason why it's called Metro is because it's actually named after our bus system. This sign was the inspiration of using of typography and simple grid layout. And this is the local Seattle public transit. And they have this manifesto, which best summarizes what Metro is. It's our design language. You call it Metro because it's modern and clean, it's fast, and it's in motion. It's about content and typography, and it's entirely authentic. And it was been so successful that they've started to bring this over into everything that Microsoft is doing right now. Another company that we've worked with and got to see their design language was BBC. And they had a simple manifesto to create one BBC with 80 million experiences. But the core concept behind their design language was this focus on radical simplicity. And they wanted to be able to use this to support divergent platforms, but have convergent experiences, bring them all together. And so this brings me to the last of the three, which is the design. And so the best way I can kind of illustrate that, and again, I know it's kind of late, and so I'll kind of go through this case study pretty quickly. But with this focus on radical simplicity, we were asked to create the global iPlayer application for iPad. The BBC has BBC Public Service, which only the residents of the UK see. They pay their license fee, and then there's BBC Worldwide. So if you live outside, then you would use this application instead. Their major focus was the US market, where they wanted to introduce British content to US customers. So they came out to Seattle, and we went through the design language, and I was immediately inspired to just create this simple grid. And I sketched it up. We have all chalkboard walls in our office. I sketched it up initially on the wall, and then later wireframed it. And we took that, and magenta, unfortunately, was this key color. And so we used magenta and white. The UK iPad application used black as the primary color, but black actually highlights the smudges and the fingerprints that you are seeing on the screen, where white kind of obscures them a little bit. So I actually made the creative call to use white as the primary color. And so we started playing around with some of these concepts along this grid that really kind of focused on, brought all this great imagery that BBC had. And we stayed pretty true to it. And they had this ribbon concept that they used in the design language, which we started to explore. And we were really fortunate to have 16 different user tests. And so we took all these different concepts, and we would bring them to the user, and the users just, every time we put more in front of them, of course, they were reacting very poorly to it, and they said, well, we don't like that. And then we would show them, we'd take something away, and they're like, well, we like that a little bit better. And then we would take something else away, and we're like, oh, well, we like that a lot. Now, luckily, the business was actually there, and the business was saying, well, it's a VOD app, put more tiles on it. So we kept kind of iterating through a lot of these different screens, and going through, and again, having a focus on putting more screens on it. And but still, we had to introduce this content to these customers. So one of the business stakeholders saw the Nike Better World, like Parallax website, and said, well, it needs to have parallax. So we scrapped all this work that we had done, and so then we added parallax to our design. And so then the user would swipe through these genres, and they would kind of come forward, and it was a beautiful visual effect. But we put it in front of users, and I was like, the users are going to love it. It's just so, like, I don't know. It's ridiculous. We all thought it was a bad idea, but we're like, it is a pretty cool visual effect. And so then we started exploring all these other parallaxing things, and it was this huge tangent that we went on, and I thought we were going to lose. But when we showed them, again, a very simple version of this site, they responded to this one and said, I like this one significantly better. And we still felt like it was simple, but it wasn't bringing focus to the content. So a very simple thing that we did was, again, we just added this. Every image on this app was 16 by 9. That was one of the requirements because they didn't want to resize the images. But an iPad screen itself isn't 16 by 9. So all we did was add these little masking bars on there to actually create a 16 by 9 illusion on the iPad and put all the navigation kind of in there. So then the content actually started to really come forward. And there's actually a lot more on the screen now than it was on the previous version, but it seems much more simple. And this just came through constant iteration with a lot of user feedback, and always staying true to these core concepts of radical simplicity, the things that were in the design language. And anytime we got stuck, we went back to the design language, we went back to these 10 design principles, and we're able to help them guide our decisions. And so this application ended up being, it's available in many markets, it's 4 stars or higher in most, and exceeded all the BBC's expectations of performance. It's still in a test mode. But I found it's really funny that the final application is actually so close to that thing that I sketched on the wall. My first instinct was to just create this grid of simple content, and after a lot of back and forth, that ended up being the final product. Now, I don't have time to show you the video, but I wanted to close and say that these are real simple three concepts: the technology and understanding what type of technology you're going to deploy. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that this comes first, but it does definitely influence your decisions. You do need to be very educated about all the different types of technology that you can employ, and then you follow that up with the creation of your own design language that supports what you're trying to do and how you want to be a compelling product. And then when you marry those two things together, you start to create these really great experiences. And so, again, there's so much great content that I've heard, and thank you again to all the speakers. And I hope that this helps you create 5-star applications. Thank you very much. Oh, great. I ended early. That's a first. Any questions? It's Friday. It's the end of the day. Oh, great. Oh, yeah.
It's great to hear the story of the BBC, and I'm sure people were familiar with the notion of having to go back and forth and sort of bark up wrong trees. And I think, so from that story versus the other story you often hear in the market of kind of the minimal viable approach where people just sort of hit the nail on the head, but could go back to just fewer people in the way of that initial instinct. Is there any advice for, is that something that small groups can do to just sort of jump in versus managing that process so that the client can kind of come to the right conclusion on their own?
Well, I think that, and it's a great question and very hard to answer. I think what I do is I'm not kind to clients. I mean, in all honesty, I tell them what it should be, and I do it until I'm red in the face and I'm exhausted and I want to quit, and sometimes I have quit. Just because I say, this is how it should be, and I understand this, and I've done my research. And one of our old development director, he once said, and it completely changed the way I looked at selling design, is he said that we could build the best app in the world, but if our clients don't know why it's good, that it could easily be the worst app in the world. And I've really taken that to heart. So now when I show something that I've had, it came in a flash of whatever in the shower, I was just like, oh, it should be like this. I prepare a very long presentation of all the reasons why it shouldn't be like this before I show them the thing that only took me like a minute or two to come up with, right? It's like they have to feel like you went through some sort of pain in order for it to be valuable. And so I think from big or small, I think that sticking with your gut and doing what you think is right, because by being here, you intrinsically know more about mobile than they do, right? Because they're not here. So share that expertise. You're researching it, you're reading the articles, and just sell it a little bit, and then you can kind of pitch those really strong ideas that you're having, those inspirational moments.
Hi.
Yeah.
I seen at the beginning of the presentation you flashed a Japanese site.
Yes.
And I've noticed that in Japan, you look at packaging of goods in supermarkets. You look at opening credits of TV shows. it's very busy, it's very complex compared to what we are used to. So when you talked about anthropology and you were testing the BBC sites for the American market, how much, it seems that culture is still such an important part of design itself.
It absolutely is, and every culture has a different design aesthetic. And I mean, that was one of the things that I've really been introduced with by working with HSBC is understanding something simple like, I was working with them on one project which was like, well, let's just show a user just kind of going through, using a mobile device or whatever. And they're like, well, we can't do that in like the Chinese market because you're supposed to bank at the same bank that your father banked with. And I never knew that, but that's something that's like really culturally important. And even though everyone banks at separate banks, but they would never ever be shown or never do a testimonial for any bank that wasn't their father's bank. And so that actually became like part of the design requirements, was to understand this cultural aspect, as well as, especially when you're dealing with Muslim countries as well. There's all sorts of things that you need to kind of consider beyond, text orientation. And so understanding that and really just being very open. Typically, the way I kind of approach those is breaking everything down into design patterns, and basically saying, is this design pattern, I might fill it full of some content, or I might present it to you in this way, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what I need to get through the HIG, or I'm talking about like a toolbar or a button, or this reusable element that could be used in lots of different ways, because there is going to be those cultural and regional kind of variations that you have to manage, and they can be difficult.
The instinct is to go universal rather than almost responsive by culture.
Yeah, I definitely. I mean, when the question was or comment was to go universal and rather than cultural, and I totally agree. I mean, I think that mobile is hard enough to start to support multiple versions. Sometimes it's required, like I mentioned. But when you break that down even further into kind of cultural considerations, it can be nearly impossible. But again, sometimes it's mandatory. Sometimes for large organizations, they have different content managers for each one of those markets, and you have to give them some sort of design rules. And that's why I use a design language which is broad enough to say, this is the rules that you need to adhere to, but you still have lots of room to maneuver within. But it still needs, you're going to use this style of typography. You're going to use a serif font instead of sans serif font. I might be not say Helvetica Neue, because maybe that's not on all devices or in every single country, right? Great comment, thanks. And that's it. Well, thank you very much.